We are back for our second video on female physiology would be the topic today. After talking on a first video about what needs to be kind of assessed when a woman wants to try and to get in best shape of her life, physically, mentally, let's say, not only aesthetically, but also performance-wise. So we went through, okay, need to be some blood tests done, need to be assess some timelines, also some body composition measurements and whatnot. So now for me personally, it would be interesting to figure out, are there any differences between male and female physiology that need to be taken into account when you decide a training plan, nutrition plan, anything? Let's say a woman comes into gym and she wants to get the best out of her next 3-6 months training or nutrition plan. What does she need to know that is different between men and women? Because we often see that somebody will just go in a gym and ask for advice, and somebody's going to give them that advice and might not necessarily know that they are giving them wrong advice, just because women might not be small men. What are your thoughts? What is your expertise, and what can you talk about this point? Because I think it's a important point to touch up on.
I think we're going to try and keep this more on the physiological differences, etc. point today, and then separate, maybe nutrition next time and training the time after that. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's obviously going to be differences in nutrition and training, which we'll touch on for sure. But when it comes down to it, obviously there are, of course, physiological differences between male and female. Majorly, the reproductive systems are obviously very different. Both males and females produce the same hormones. It's just at different levels. Female testosterone is very, very low. They make endogenously between 0.5 and 1 milligram per day. There's a slight peak during that ovulatory phase of menstruation. But it's relatively steady and quite low. And then their estrogen and progesterone hormones fluctuate throughout the different phases of menstruation. So I would say the main differences is right there. And that's also one of the most important distinctions to make, because the females that we're talking with, the age they're at, where they are in their life, fertility is going to matter for some, if not all of them. And then the ability to maintain fertility and reproductive health is crucial for a female. And often what you're seeing is just an overdone prescription of energy output, and not considering the energy input. And then they are basically skewed to the point where there's this critical threshold of energy availability that needs to be maintained to maintain normal physiological and hormonal functioning of a female. And that's 13.6 kcals per lean pound of mass. So if they dip below that energy availability threshold, they are disrupting things. There's no way to know exactly for sure in what order will things cascade down. But basically, at that point, the body is starting to have to pay attention to what's most important for survival. And in a state where energy availability is low, the body's not going to prioritize the ability to reproduce, just from a biological survival standpoint. So if females are constantly dipping below that energy availability threshold, they are running the risks of hypothalamic amenorrhea, where their menstruation cycle becomes intermittent. 24 to 32 days or so is approximately a normal cycle. And once you start seeing a few cycles in a row where it's going longer between, you're basically meeting the clinical definition, and you are running the risks or increasing the risks of fertility issues down the road. So I think that is the most important difference. And then, of course, if they're enhanced, things change even more so.
So when you talk about the reproductive system and whatnot, is this same for men who are on really extremely low calories? Would that affect them in the same way?
Their ability to still impregnate somebody is there. The function of their their body may be hindered if they are extremely low, because if they are a natural athlete, and they are so lean that their testosterone is now basically plummeted and they're hypogonadal, they may have like erectile dysfunction or certain issues. But if they were able to get it out, get it in, it could still do its job. There's no question. And then obviously nowadays with, the at least here in Canada, TRT, like the testosterone replacement therapy, is the biggest trend going. And of course, they have things like Viagra and Cialis that are just keeping these things functioning. And I wouldn't be at all surprised to see 80-year-old men fathering babies to 20 and 30-year-old females here and there, and not live long enough to see the baby get, to the 10-year birthday. So it's definitely different, because the men just need to have that ability to get that there, and they're making that a lot easier. Females is a lot more complicated.
So when you talk about females having it a lot more complicated, is it complicated because of them aging, or because of what actually happens there? Can you expand on that? Because it's I think it's quite interesting, because you see a lot of girls trying to get in shape now, a lot older than before. What I mean by that, you'll see women in their 30s, 40s, 50s trying to get in their best shape of their life, and sometimes not necessarily understanding that it can affect their health on that side, not just overall health in terms of physical performance, but also their ability to maybe have kids. And then maybe later along the line, is there something else apart from just having a kid? Because I have worked with women who have kids in their 40s, late 40s.
Well, I mean, it obviously, there's the biological clock that's ticking on females. They get 30-ish, 35, maybe 40 years of regular menstrual cycles in life, theoretically, and then they go into that perimenopausal and menopausal state where they're essentially not producing the hormones anymore, and therefore they can't get pregnant. Of course, if you are fast tracking that by not providing sufficient energy to the body or energy availability, then that's going to fast track this, and then you could actually render yourself infertile. It's not meant to be a scare tactic, as in it's super common, but it is a physiological possibility, and it's not necessary is the biggest thing. Like, normally what you see coaches giving females is protocols that are just destroying them for no good reason. They could reach similar goals, probably much better actually, and not have any of those worries to even consider. But because it's just a template they're given, or it's a trend, or it's a fad on the internet, it's not considering their physiology, and they're just kind of basically running the body into the ground.
So correct me if I'm wrong. What I'm hearing is, if a coach is coaching you the same way they are coaching a man, they are probably not taking in consideration all these kind of things. And the main difference is that female body most likely is on some kind of like a time zone where you can harm it beyond repair, whereas males, when we talk about reproduction and all those kind of things, whereas male body probably going to recover and still be able to do these kind of things even in very old age.
Yeah, that biological clock ticking is basically just because once menopause reaches, the body's just not producing those hormones, so therefore it cannot, it can't provide the environment to have a baby. When I talk about the critical energy availability threshold, that's how you determine that. Is it's your energy in minus your energy out. That what's left over has to be above that threshold. So 13.6 kcals, call it 13, call it 15, per pound of lean muscle. That's what needs to be left over after you've accounted for all your expenditures. It's not your total caloric intake needs to be 13.6 kcals per lean pound. That's not going to be sufficient. Now, there are cases where this needs to be accomplished to meet a goal. And I'm definitely not saying, because I prep females for competitions and, stage lean and calendar or photo shoot, whatever, all the time, you can do it. And you're going to recover perfectly fine. but you are increasing risks every time you get that lean. And so the approach to getting that lean is super relevant, because if it's a crash diet, it's just too hard on the system, and the recoverability is going to get harder and harder each time. The body does not want to basically be starved like that. You want to kind of coax it along and let the adaptations develop over time, not force them. So if they are doing something like that, they want to make sure that their approach is a longer, lower, slower sort of timeline. So the body is just sort of adapting with the changes as they are happening, and not being forced to just right away start cutting corners, down regulating metabolism, shutting off the menstrual cycle, etc. Because it's just that much more stress on the body, which is accumulating over time.
So to me, from what I'm hearing is, when it comes to differences between physiology for men and women, men probably can get away with really harsh diets and whatnot and still recover well, whereas women would really benefit if they were focusing on what we talked about in first video, getting the timeline right, understanding their goal, and understanding how much they actually can push their body, because it's extremely important not only get in a shape, but get in a shape in a healthy way, which for women is way more important than for men. And
Absolutely.
let me know if this sounds somewhat right, that women would definitely benefit comparing themselves less to fitness models, and actually understanding that what they see in photos on social media is probably unrealistic for 90-something% of female population out there.
Well, what we're seeing on
I'm
social
talking
media
about
is
extremes of like Miss Olympia, Mr. Olympia, and those kind of physiques.
all the physiques that are being basically portrayed as um, what everyone's looking to achieve, right? Like that very, very lean level. 99% of them are not natural. So right off the bat, if you are natural, which to each their own, you have to understand right away that what they have achieved, you probably can't. So you have to be real with that. And unfortunately, because it's such a taboo topic, they're all lying and saying they are natural, or they didn't do this or they didn't do that. But that's exactly what it is. It's just lies. So from an aesthetic point of view, you could, the male and female could both get lean enough. Um, the rebound will be different because men will bulk right after, which just means they're just going to eat like an asshole and get fat. And that's going to help their body recover, though, where the female is going to try desperately to keep that leanness going as long as she possibly can. And she's going to fall victim to that nonsense reverse dieting, where, from a physiological standpoint, it's just nonsense. And she's going to keep herself in that energy deficit or however long. And that's going to prolong the negative adaptations that have occurred and not allow the body to recover. And it needs to. So what we're seeing online is it's totally not realistic, but it can be achieved. But I would say that if a female wants that and wants to maintain that, they probably want to consider their family life, if that's the goal, as the priority first. Because if your dream is to have a family and your goal is to look a certain way to help achieve that, if, you know, hopefully not, but if for some reason that caused you to have a problem and now fertility is an issue, how happy are you going to be 10 years later when you've actually caused a problem and you can't have a baby or something like that? So it's not that it's super, super common, but it is a possibility. So I would do everything in my power to avoid increasing those risks if I was a female considering family of some sort. It doesn't say you can't, that doesn't mean you can't be healthy, look good, feel good. It just means how you go about doing that is really relevant to avoid any unnecessary, potentially permanent damages done.
So it probably brings me not only to physiological differences, but psychological as well, that men are just more tolerant to, yeah, I'm just going to get out of shape, whatever. Whereas women always want to present themselves, feel confident, feel sexy, and all those kind of things. And that probably is completely different topics that needs to be addressed, that more often than not, you staying in that shape, which is shape of your life, for longer than necessary is causing more bad than good.
It definitely is. But the other thing with that is the approach to get to that level. If you were extremely aggressive, you were below that energy availability threshold the entire time, you didn't eat carbs, you ran cardio for 2 hours a day, whatever your approaches were, the common ones are similar to that. There's no way you'll be able to maintain that. Your body won't, it just won't allow that to happen, right? Over time, you're going to have things like ghrelin hormones stuff, just things out of your control that are just going to force you to start to put that weight back on.
Yeah.
Whereas if you took your time and actually improved your body composition slowly over time, your ability to maintain a different physique gets easier and easier and easier the more lean tissue you put on. And you're not going to put on any lean tissue in an energy deficit as a natural. So you're really just digging a hole deeper and deeper the longer you stay in that deficit. And if you're trying to stay in a deficit to maintain that physique, you're really just shooting yourself in the foot.
And what you mean by deficit is everyone's favorite reverse dieting, which to me just makes no sense whatsoever.
No, it doesn't make any sense to me either. And I have never reverse dieted anybody. And I have had multiple females compete. And to me, a female that's going to do a bikini competition or a physique competition or something, that's the extreme level of leanness that an athlete would be striving for. And as soon as their show is done, that deficit's done. We're out of it that day. Like, it's over. There's no need to spend 6 months slowly climbing out of that deficit. The analogy that I like is if you put your hand in a pot of boiling water, would you slowly pull it back out, or would you yank your hand out because it's boiling water? To me, it's a no-brainer. From a physiological point of view, your body's under that same sort of stress. If you've been depriving it of nutrients that it needs for normal hormonal function, energy availability, etc., you need to reverse that as quickly as possible. So to reverse it over the course of what the original context of reverse dieting was something like adding like 10 or 20 grams of carbs like per week. Like, from a error margin on a nutrition label, you can't even be that accurate. So to me, it's just a complete waste of time. And at the end of the day, you need to get a certain amount of body fat back on for hormonal production to resume if your fertility is important to you. So if you've already had your family and you're not concerned about that, you're in a different physiological state. It's a different approach in certain ways. But the demographic that I'm typically working with, that's not usually the case. They may have, hopes to have a baby soon, or they may be young mothers or something like that, like young babies at home. They still have to maintain a lot of hormonal health for a lot of reasons. So I think that the reverse dieting thing was a very clever, I don't know if it was an intentional gimmick, but it was very clever nonetheless, in the sense that it's basically just keeping people dieting forever and then keeping them needing help because they have all these physiological problems that they're dealing with. And it's because they just kept starving. I think the goal is, obviously, when you come off of your diet or whatever you did to achieve your goal, you can't go back to eating the way you were because you're a physiologically different person now. So you have to treat yourself the way you are now. Whatever your body composition is now is how you determine your energy availability or your energy intake, not 12 weeks or 16 weeks prior when your body fat was much, much higher. So that's usually the mistake that people are made. Their show's over and they just go back to eating the way they were, and then they rebound like crazy, and then psychologically they're all defeated. It doesn't work that way. Who you are at that moment is how you determine what you need.
To me, it almost sounds as if it was down to you, you would focus on let's get as much muscle as we can on you without forcing that body fat loss, and then see if we actually need to do anything else because your physiology will change. And this is bringing me to the next question. What are the differences in body fat distribution between men and women? And how is that affecting everything that is geared towards getting a body of they want really and they crave?
Typically what we see is that apple pear shape. That's pretty normal. There are, of course, outliers where the male holds most of their body fat around their midsection to sort of protect those vital organs. And the females hold their body fat more like waist and below, thighs, glutes, etc. And that's pretty standard. As a female approaches menopause, because their estrogen, progesterone production comes to a halt, you see that body fat distribution change to a more male-like pattern where the body fat starts to go waist and up. That's not a coincidence. That's literally like from a hormonal point of view, we are now much similar as a male when you're a menopausal female. So the difference is basically that. And then women are sort of like, Lyle will be the best at sort of, his literature is the best at kind of pointing these things out, but women are sort of just standing no chance at getting super, super lean. Like from a biological point of view, their body is so wired to prevent that, because this isn't a sexist point of view, but they have the ability to reproduce. We're not carrying the baby, the female is. So the body is doing everything it can to maintain that ability to reproduce. So female's body does not want to give up essential fats. It's going to do everything it can to avoid that, which is why the professional aesthetic competitors are using drugs. They're using drugs to sort of trump those endogenous hormones to make this a reality. So as the females are getting leaner and leaner, it's going to be very difficult to get that last little body fat off of their legs and glutes, etc., because the body is trying desperately to hold on to that. And there are even these phenomena known as reesterification, where they may be able to mobilize some triglycerides, say from the upper body, and then if they're not oxidized, meaning if you didn't burn that off, it restores down in the lower half. So sometimes females are getting leaner in their upper body and putting more fat on in their lower body, because it's just the way they're genetically wired. That's just the way it is. They really have to dig deep and get to pretty low energy intakes to get that last little bit of fat off, which is why it's such a unhealthy place to be for a long period of time, because the amount of calories that are needed is very, very low, and it's not enough to sustain life long term. So the body is going to do its best to make sure that you stop doing that.
So going up from this, how do the differences in these physiology, hormonal balances and whatnot, affecting energy levels, nutritional needs, mood, all those kind of things? Is there some things that, let's say, women are more resilient than men? Maybe resistance training, maybe cardiovascular training, maybe psychological, some kind of stuff. How do these differences between men and women are affecting both? Let's say what I just listed up, your mood, your training, your nutrition, how you deal with all those things. Are there many differences, or is everything just the same?
I think there are subtle differences for sure. The estrogen that's much higher in female than a male, it has a lot of benefits from a cardiovascular point of view, a recovery ability point of view in gym. But I think what is most important is for the females to, instead of prioritizing all the time dieting, as in an energy deficit, always dieting, they need to, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, spend more time putting on lean tissue. I know there's this fear of getting too bulky, but hormonally, they're not wired to get big. It's very difficult for a female to get big unless they are taking an exogenous hormone. If they're not, they're just not going to get big. They're physiologically a smaller species, and that's just the way it's going to be. But they want that lean tissue, because that lean tissue is very good for long-term health, good at preventing bone mineral loss, so osteoporosis. We want to prioritize putting muscle on. Obviously, the more lean muscle you have on your body, if you remember that 13.6 kcal per pound of lean body mass, the more muscle, the more calories you get to maintain. So I often tell my clients, it's like kind of like your daily allowance. Would you rather get $1,000 a day to spend or $1,500? And that's going to come down to same body weight. Someone has more muscle, they get more food to keep that same physiological body composition. So I think it's really important that they put more emphasis and time into putting muscle on than to constantly try to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And the way that you see that happening, I mean, I know we're going to touch on training later, but usually the training protocols just aren't catered to that, because the female is a natural athlete. They're not taking, an anabolic steroid. So their training approach should not be the same as a male bodybuilder who's training for Olympia, or even a bikini, IFBB pro bikini, because she's not natural. They need to be prioritizing strength training, as in a certain amount of intensity weight on the bar. Otherwise, these 3 sets of 12, 3 sets of 15, for most of the time, that's not going to stimulate enough muscle growth to really make much of a difference. And if anything, it's taking you twice as long, and you're burning more calories doing that. And if your energy intake is still as low as it is, and you're taking twice as long in the gym, you're actually making your energy availability even less than it would have been. So there's a lot of things that need to be considered that all kind of work together in synergy. There's not really one quick fix answer for women, but I would say if there was one thing that they should really prioritize on, that would be putting muscle on their body and avoiding dipping below that energy availability threshold as often as possible. I mean, if the goal requires it, I understand the goal requires it, but you want to do your best to make sure that that goal doesn't require that all year round, because you're just going to dig a hole. And eventually you're going to be, from my experience anyways, the ones that I've seen, very unhappy.
So is this right, assuming that for somebody who just started working out, have never done any kind of training and whatnot, would be really beneficial as a woman to learn movement patterns and increase their overall strength first before starting to do anything hypertrophy specific, so they can actually use higher loads for this hypertrophy specific work instead of spending years and years and years with little pink dumbbells?
I think that's, I mean, from a mechanicalistic point of view, I think it's important that obviously the bar path is accurate to their anatomical variances. Like, the trend in fitness is to squat ass to grass, or, every woman should be able to deadlift their own body weight, etc. Like right away, that should be their goals. If you take a female that's working at a desk, and then you put her into the gym after she sat all day and said, deadlift your body weight, next year she'll have a herniated disc. So I think the bar path, the overall technique and the exercise, that's very, very specific and a totally separate topic. But yes, it's crucial that females know that. That's for injury resilience over time. And then, as you say, the first little bit of gains they're going to have is neurological, where their brain is actually learning the bar path and getting more efficient at it. So therefore, they'll be able to increase the intensity, i.e. the load on the bar. That should be their goal. All the while, the nutrition side of things just needs to be adequate to fuel what they're trying to accomplish. And then from there, it just depends on the goal and the timelines. I think that if a female is looking to approach a level of leanness that's just not necessarily sustainable long term, they should really do their best to make sure that timeline is sufficient enough that they aren't forcing any sort of aggressive, extreme approaches for much of a duration at all, because it's just going to cause more issues after the goal is accomplished or the date is been achieved.
So that brings me to a question about what kind of differences do we see in male and female bone density, muscle mass, things like that. Is there something that's really kind of different, or as a woman they should take a bit more care of, or maybe not care much about it? What's the difference there?
Well, when you look at stats like hip replacements, people falling and breaking hips, it's more female than male. And then if you look at the lifestyle leading up to that, there's a big difference. There's a lot more physicality happening typically, not always, on the male side versus the female side. Like if you think of your grandfather and your grandmother, think of what they accomplished or what they did all their lives. And then, that's very, very common. If a female, and they should, spend time strength training, 80-85% rep max, they're going to maintain and possibly even increase bone mineral density. That's going to come from strength training.
Mm.
That's like their biggest stimulus to provide that. So I think it should be definitely the forefront of priorities when it comes to their training. And then the goals that you hear about, obviously influenced by social media, is to have a certain physique. Lately, it seems like the trend is, big glutes, big glutes. Um, if you want to have bigger glutes, you need to make bigger glutes, and you're going to make them by increasing your ability in the gym. So progressive overload and building bigger glutes. Getting fatter is going to make bigger glutes as well, but it's not the same thing. And despite all the clever angles and spandex that you see, a coach that knows what they're doing can see through that a mile away. So if you're trying to change the shape of your body, you need to change the size of the muscle. Um, and that's really, really crucial, I think. So oftentimes what you have to have is more emphasis put on strength training and less on that aerobic style, 3 sets of 15 all the time, with every lift. But females are a little bit smaller in general. But so they're going to have smaller muscles, smaller heart, smaller everything, etc. But their ability to put on strength or put on muscle is no real different than a male. In fact, with their elevated estrogen, they may be able to do a higher frequency training and recover better than a male, assuming they're both natural people. So I think a woman should spend a little bit more time lifting and less time on the stair mill to prioritize lean contractile tissue, and then more time in, call it a maintenance or a caloric surplus than in a deficit. And what we're seeing is the exact opposite. We're seeing more time spent on cardio and more time in an energy deficit. And those are both counterproductive to their goal, believe it or not, and to long-term health and sustainability. That's like the worst recipe.
So what I'm keep hearing is just longer, slower approaches. The main
Yeah.
difference between female and male. So let me see if my summary is somewhat resembling what you are thinking about. That there are massive differences in reproductive system, and main difference is a timeline that men most likely don't have that timeline, whereas we females do. And being in severe calorie deficit, always trying to run yourself in the ground by trying to chase the perfection of your physique is only gonna kind of highlight issues down the line. So if you are ever thinking about creating a family or something like that, maybe focus on that first, because you can get in shape no matter what later on without much of an issues.
Yeah,
Then
you can
hormonal
be in shape.
fluctuations, and that comes in also with hormonal fluctuations with age. That we know that males and females have these fluctuations, but it probably affects women harsher than men.
Well, yeah, well, the male hormones are pretty steady, like a like a freight train. Like there's, if you look at a testosterone curve, it's just kind of there, kind of cruising along. Females, they'll go through that spike in estrogen in the follicular phase, followed by a spike in progesterone and a slightly smaller spike in estrogen in luteal. So like they have a pretty big roller coaster of hormones happening every month in theory. And a lot of things that, from a physiological standpoint, that occur during those hormonal fluctuations, females can't control. So, and it's not a bad thing. It's an important that you understand it thing, because if you do, you can get real fancy with your training and your nutrition and etc. And prioritize certain macronutrient distributions and certain training protocols on different phases of your cycle, which I'm sure we'll touch on, in the upcoming videos. But it is still very, very possible. You see it everywhere, to be, looking good and being healthy and still prioritize fertility. It can be done. It's just that the approach that's taken is really going to be what's detrimental or not, in terms of, are you causing more long-term problems or complications or not? I mean, the body can obviously reproduce at low body fat levels. It's just that at what point is the breaking point? Like, where do you cross that threshold and cause an actual issue? it's going to be different for everyone. So if we talk, like we talked about in the first video, if you're paying attention to blood work, and as we go through the series, we nail down the nutrition, the training things. If everything kind of comes together, you'll be able to achieve 99% of your goals without any worries at all. It'll still always come down to the priority, though. If the priority is a family, that's will always need to be considered. And then the timeline, whatever your timeline is on that. But everything can be done simultaneously if the approach is sort of, catered to you and your physiology specifically.
And last difference, but not the least important, is women probably would benefit way more if they focused on strength training above everything, and only then focus on getting your hypertrophy work done and whatnot. Whereas it's for men, we just naturally get stronger quicker. And probably psychologically, men are more geared up to lifting heavy all the time.
Well, that was what I was about to say. Like, I think if you look in the gym, like anytime you go, look, the guy will be grunting and trying to push weight. The female will be very controlled, moving it, at a snail's pace. Depending on their goals, that could be right, could be wrong. But typically, from my experience, almost 100% of the time, my new female clients are underestimating how strong they are. So they're in there lifting very timidly, and what they're stimulating their body to do is basically nothing, because they can lift much, much more. I often, give them scenarios like, the hip thrust is the most, popular exercise the last, 5-10 years, because everyone wants to grow glutes. And then you'll see a female hip thrusting like 50 pounds. So then I'll say, like, well, what if somebody sat on top of you? Could you not thrust them up? Like, nobody's 50 pounds. So like, you gotta put some effort into the lifting. And I don't know where that hesitation comes from. I understand from, I can't speak, from experience on this, but from what I'm told, I understand that the gym itself, oftentimes the atmosphere isn't the most appealing to some females. So I get that. But at the end of the day, the body is, it doesn't really care what we think. It's going to just respond and adapt to whatever signaling you send it. And if you're in there lifting weights that just aren't heavy enough for the muscle that you're trying to stimulate, it's just not going to adapt. It has no need to, because you're not stressing it enough. So women need to focus on strength training, and with that, hypertrophy will come. And then obviously, if they're enhanced or not, the way you design the training protocols will differ to prioritize if it's strength or if it's hypertrophy or whatever the goal happens to be.
Awesome. No, Scott, thanks for your time. This has been really valuable, and we're going to touch up on next things on following videos.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you.